Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we dive into tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below if you enjoy listening to late night stories. Your support helps this channel keep growing, and I promise there will be many more stories waiting for you before you go to sleep. Now, let's step into the rain-washed streets of Portland, Oregon. It was a Tuesday morning, the 18th of October, 2022. The city had just woken up to a heavy drizzle that had carried on since dawn. Portland's Pearl District looked like it was painted in shades of gray, the sidewalks glistening with rainwater, and the sound of passing cars splashing through puddles filled the air. Around 9:15 a.m., a small cafe on Northwest 13th Avenue, Maple and Steam, was already half full. The scent of roasted beans mixed with the faint smell of damp coats and umbrellas being shaken out by customers who had rushed in from the rain. The barista, a tall young man named Oliver with rolled up sleeves and messy hair, was working the espresso machine while humming to himself. Near the window, a woman in her late 30s sat alone. Her name was Rebecca Turner. She had a half-open laptop in front of her, though her gaze was lost outside the fogged-up glass. Drops of rain traced lines down the window pane, blurring the view of people hurrying by with newspapers and coffee cups in hand. Rebecca stirred her cappuccino absent-mindedly, the foam already beginning to collapse. She had been coming to this cafe almost every morning since summer, always choosing the same corner seat. People rarely paid attention to her, but that day something different was about to unfold. At 9:27 a.m., the door swung open with chime, letting in a gust of cold air and the sharp smell of wet pavement. A man stepped inside, mid-40s tall, with a navy trench coat and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His name was Daniel Whitmore. He shook the rain from his shoulders, removed his glasses to wipe the lenses, then scanned the room as if looking for someone. Rebecca noticed him immediately, not because he was handsome in a rugged way, but because there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. It had been almost 12 years since she had last seen him, and back then, he was someone she never thought she'd encounter again. Daniel ordered a black coffee, his voice low and steady, and then turned. His gaze moved across the cafe, before settling on the woman by the window. For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin, the chatter and clinking cups fading into the background. He froze. Rebecca's heart thudded faster. She tried to look away, to hide behind her laptop screen, but Daniel was already walking toward her table. His steps were slow, cautious, as though he wasn't sure how welcome his presence would be. The atmosphere in the cafe remained ordinary. People typing on keyboards, the hiss of steam, a soft indie track playing from the overhead speakers. But between Rebecca and Daniel, the air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. When he finally stopped by her table, Daniel placed his cup down, pulled out the chair across from her, and asked quietly, "Rebecca Turner, is it really you?" Her spoon slipped from her hand, clattering softly against the saucer. She looked up, searching his face for the years that had passed. The rain outside beat harder against the glass, almost in rhythm with her pulse. Rebecca blinked, her throat tightening as she tried to form a reply. The last time she had spoken to Daniel was in the spring of 2010, inside a hospital hallway in Seattle, and their farewell had not been pleasant. She had carried the bitterness of that day with her for years, folding it neatly into the corners of her memory, until it became something she rarely pulled out anymore. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, his hair speckled with raindrops, his expression caught between disbelief and longing. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice quieter than she intended. "I didn't think I'd ever see you here, not in Portland, not this way." He sat down slowly, careful not to intrude too quickly, as though he half expected her to tell him to leave. "I didn't think so either. I was supposed to be in Seattle this week, but the meeting got canceled. I took the train down last night. Something just pulled me here this morning." He looked around briefly before his eyes settled back on her. "I never imagined I'd find you sitting by this window." Rebecca's fingers curled around her coffee cup, which had already grown lukewarm. She studied him carefully, noticing the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw looked more defined than she remembered, and the quiet weariness he carried in his posture. Silence stretched between them, interrupted only by the sound of milk being frothed at the counter. Outside, the drizzle thickened into a steadier rain, streaking the glass until the world beyond blurred into a watercolor gray. "Why now?" Rebecca asked finally, her tone steady but her heart still uneasy. "It's been years. 12 years, Daniel. People don't just appear in each other's lives again without a reason." Daniel leaned back slightly, taking a sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "You're right. But when I saw you, I thought maybe the universe had grown tired of us avoiding each other." His voice carried a low warmth, though it was tempered with caution. "Rebecca, I don't know what you've been through since then, but I know I owe you an explanation for what happened back in Seattle." Rebecca's gaze hardened. That chapter of her life was one she rarely revisited, not even in conversations with friends or family. She had buried it deep, focusing instead on her job at the publishing house, her quiet apartment in the Pearl District, her daily rituals that kept her moving forward. And now, with just a single morning's rain and a familiar face, all of it was being tugged back to the surface. Before she could respond, Oliver, the barista, approached their table. He smiled politely, placing a fresh pot of chamomile tea on Rebecca's side. "Thought you might like this on a rainy day," he said, his tone friendly but a little curious as he glanced at Daniel. Then he nodded and returned to the counter. Rebecca exhaled slowly. "You left me standing there, Daniel, in that hospital hallway, when I needed someone to stand with me. Do you even remember what you said before you walked away?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as though the memory itself stung. "I remember every word, and I regret them more than anything else I've ever done." Her jaw tightened. "You said I would regret choosing the path I did, that I wasn't strong enough, and then you walked out." "I was a coward," Daniel admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know how to handle the situation. I was scared of what it meant for both of us, and instead of staying, I ran. That was the worst mistake of my life." The cafe seemed to grow quieter, even though people were still typing, talking, sipping. Rebecca pressed her lips together, fighting back a storm of emotions. She had spent years telling herself she didn't need closure, that the past was better left untouched. But now, sitting face to face with him, she realized how much weight she had carried all this time. "You don't get to just walk back into my life and say you regret it," she said softly, her voice trembling more with each word. "Do you know what I went through after that day? Do you know how alone I felt?" Daniel leaned forward, his eyes filled with something raw. "I don't. Not fully. But I want to. I want to hear it, even if it hurts me. I can't undo the past, Rebecca, but I can listen now, if you let me." For a moment, Rebecca wanted to tell him to leave, to disappear back into the rainy streets and never return. Yet another part of her, a quieter but persistent part, urged her to stay, to let the conversation unravel. Perhaps it wasn't forgiveness she was seeking, but understanding. The rain hammered against the windows, blurring the outside world until the cafe felt like an island. Rebecca's thoughts drifted back to 2010, to the sterile smell of antiseptic in that hospital corridor, the distant sound of machines beeping, and the decision she had been forced to make alone. She hadn't told anyone in Portland about it. Not her colleagues, not her neighbors, not even her closest friend. She looked at Daniel now, seeing not just the man who had once broken her, but also the man who might finally help her face what she had tried so hard to forget. "All right," she said finally, her voice quieter. "But not here." Not with all these people around. If you're serious, we'll talk. Later. Daniel nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. Anywhere you want. Just tell me when and where. Rebecca glanced at her watch. It was almost 10:15 now. The cafe had grown busy with the late morning rush, and the noise level was climbing. She closed her laptop, slid it into her bag, and stood up. There's a bookstore 2 blocks down, on Lovejoy Street, she said. They have a small reading room in the back. It's usually quiet. Meet me there at 11. Daniel's posture straightened, and for the first time since entering the cafe, his expression carried something close to hope. I'll be there. Rebecca gathered her things, her coat still damp from the morning drizzle. She didn't look back as she pushed open the cafe door, stepping into the steady rain. The cold drops stung her cheeks, but her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the memories she had tried to bury for over a decade. Inside, Daniel remained at the table, staring at the empty chair across from him. He thought about all the years he had wasted, all the nights he had replayed that hospital scene in his head, wondering if it was already too late. Now, fate had placed Rebecca in front of him again, and he couldn't afford to let the chance slip away. By the time Rebecca reached the bookstore, the rain had turned into a fine mist, soft but relentless. The glass door swung open easily, releasing the comforting smell of paper and ink. She walked past rows of new releases, past shelves of travel guides and biographies, until she found the small reading room at the back. It was dimly lit, with 2 leather chairs, a wooden table, and a large clock ticking on the wall. She sat down, waiting. Each minute stretched longer than the last. She wasn't sure Daniel would truly come, or if he would find another excuse to run. At 11 sharp, the door creaked open. Daniel stepped inside, his trench coat slightly darker from the rain, his satchel resting against his shoulder. He paused at the entrance, as though making sure she wouldn't change her mind. When she gave a small nod, he closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ticking clock filled the silence. Then Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes steady on his. You said you wanted to listen, she began, her voice low, but steady this time. So listen, because I'm only going to say this once. Daniel placed his coffee-stained notebook on the table, his hands resting firmly on it, and looked at her with full attention. And Rebecca began to unravel the story she had hidden for 12 long years. Rebecca drew in a long breath. Her fingers trembled slightly as they touched the edge of the wooden table before her. The dim yellow lamp above them cast a soft shadow across her face, while the ticking of the clock on the wall echoed clearly, as though marking the seconds towards something inevitable. 12 years ago, she began, her eyes locked on Daniel. I didn't just lose something. I lost myself. And in that moment, you left me with words that still echo inside my head. Daniel leaned forward, his body tense, his gaze steady but full of remorse. I know, and I'm ready to hear it, even if it makes me hate myself more than I already do. Rebecca let out a heavier sigh this time. Do you remember why we were in that hospital back then? Daniel nodded slowly. I remember. You had complications, and we had to make a decision no one should ever have to make. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She gave a faint nod, then pressed on. That day, I felt the entire world collapse. I had to choose between trying to hold on to something I hadn't even seen the face of, or holding on to my own life. The doctors made it clear what the risks were, but I wanted to try. I wanted to fight for it. And then you, instead of standing beside me, you said I wasn't strong enough. You said I would regret it. And before I could even reply, you walked away. A tear slid down her cheek. Her hand tightened into a fist. Do you know what happened after that? I was alone. I signed the papers alone. I listened to the machine slowly quiet down alone. I stared at that cold white ceiling alone. That memory haunted me, Daniel. For years. Daniel covered his face with both hands, his shoulders shaking. He drew in a sharp breath, fighting against a wave of guilt. Rebecca, God, I was such a fool. A coward. I couldn't bear to see you like that. So I ran, when the only thing I should have done was hold your hand and stay. Her gaze hardened. But you didn't. You left me there. The silence stretched. Outside, the faint sound of rain against the windows seeped into the room, adding weight to the atmosphere. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, Daniel said finally, his voice hoarse. But I need you to know, not a single day has passed without me remembering your face in that hallway. I tried to build a life. I moved from city to city, worked different jobs. But every morning I woke with the same emptiness, because I knew I had abandoned the person I loved the most when she needed me. Rebecca lowered her gaze. His words made her chest tighten. For years, she had built walls around her heart, convincing herself she was done with the past. But now, sitting across from him, the cracks in those walls began to show. I don't know what to do, she whispered. Every time I remember, I'm angry. Angry at the world, angry at myself. And most of all, angry at you. But now, seeing you here, I just feel tired. Tired of carrying this on my own. Daniel slid his chair a little closer, his eyes red from tears. If you hate me, I'll accept it. If you never want to see me again after today, I'll go. But give me a chance, just one, to make up for even a fraction of what I did. Let me be here for you this time. Rebecca stared at him, long and searching. The clock ticked steadily above them, every sound like a knock against her fragile resolve. You say you want to make it up to me, she said finally. But how? You can't bring back what was lost. You can't erase those nights I spent alone with nothing but guilt. I know, Daniel said quickly. I can't erase the past, but I can be present now. I can listen, really listen, whenever you want to speak. I can try to understand your pain instead of running from it. I can start today, right here in this room, if you'll let me. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. A part of her wanted to refuse, to keep the distance intact so she wouldn't risk being hurt again. But another part longed for someone's presence, even if that someone was Daniel, the man who had once shattered her. She brushed away the tear from her cheek. I can't promise anything, Daniel. I don't know if I can forgive you, but maybe I can try to talk to you again. Slowly, Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening with cautious hope. That's more than enough. Thank you, Rebecca. The atmosphere in the small reading room shifted. It was still heavy, still thick with unresolved pain, but there was a faint light pushing through, like rain easing even while the sky remained gray. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, glancing at the clock that now pointed toward 11:30. I've got a little time before I have to return to the office. If you really want to listen, I can tell you what my life was like after that day. I want to know everything, Daniel replied without hesitation, from beginning to end. Rebecca studied him for a moment, then gave a small, bitter smile that still carried honesty. She began to tell him about leaving Seattle, about moving to Portland with nothing but a small suitcase and nearly drained savings. She told him how she worked in a bookstore before finally landing a job in publishing. She described the long, rainy nights when the silence pressed too hard against the walls, when she refused to let herself cry anymore. Daniel listened intently. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anything with empty words. He simply sat there, eyes fixed on her, letting each sentence flow out. Occasionally he nodded, occasionally his eyes welled up, but he stayed. And for the first time in 12 years, Rebecca felt she wasn't alone in telling the story she had carried all by herself. Rebecca spoke slowly, her voice steady but laced with the weight of old wounds. She described her move to Portland, How the city at first felt like a stranger to her, with its endless rain and unfamiliar streets. When I first arrived, she said, I rented a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat. The walls were so thin, I could hear the machines running through the night. I would lie awake, listening to the hum, and tell myself it was better than silence. Because silence reminded me too much of that hospital room. Daniel's throat tightened. He imagined her there, carrying her grief alone, surrounded by nothing but the sound of spinning laundry machines. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, but he restrained himself. He knew she might not be ready for that. Rebecca continued. I worked at a small bookstore in Selwood for 2 years. It didn't pay much, but being surrounded by shelves of stories made me feel less alone. Customers would come in with their umbrellas dripping, asking for novels or poetry, and I'd lose myself in helping them. It was easier to disappear into other people's stories than to face my own. She paused, her gaze drifting to the floor. Sometimes, late at night, I would take a book home and read until morning just to keep from thinking. Her voice grew quieter. But no matter how hard I tried, the memories always came back. That hallway, that decision, your absence. I would hear your words in my head, over and over, telling me I wasn't strong enough. It haunted me, Daniel. It still does. Daniel lowered his head, shame burning in his chest. I can't take those words back. They were cruel, and they were wrong. I said them because I was afraid. I wasn't strong enough. Not you. I projected my weakness onto you, and I left. I've hated myself for it every day since. Rebecca looked at him sharply. Then why now? Why show up after 12 years? Why not stay gone? Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his damp hair. Because running never worked. I tried, believe me. I tried to bury myself in work, in travel, in meaningless connections. But nothing erased the guilt. Nothing filled the emptiness. And when I saw you this morning in the cafe, I realized I didn't want to run anymore. I don't know if fate is real, but something brought me there. To you. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. You talk about fate as if it makes this easier. But I can't just pretend the past didn't happen. You left me at my lowest point, Daniel. You don't get to just sit here and ask for a second chance. I know, he replied quickly, his voice trembling. I'm not asking for forgiveness today or tomorrow or maybe ever. I'm asking for the chance to be here, to listen, to share whatever part of your life you'll let me. If that means nothing more than sitting across from you in silence, I'll take it, because even that is better than walking away again. For a long moment, Rebecca said nothing. The clock ticked. The rain tapped against the window, and the bookstore outside remained hushed, only the faint shuffle of footsteps echoing between aisles. Finally, she whispered, I don't know if I believe you, but I suppose I'm too tired to carry this alone anymore. Maybe talking to you, even if it doesn't fix anything, will make it lighter. Daniel nodded, his eyes softening with relief. Then let me carry some of it with you. Rebecca looked at him, uncertain. There was a fragility in her expression, but also a spark of curiosity she hadn't felt in years. She leaned forward slightly. Fine, but if you vanish again, if you even try, don't ever come back. I won't, Daniel promised. Not this time. The tension eased just enough for them to sit in silence together. Rebecca sipped the now lukewarm chamomile tea Oliver had given her earlier. Daniel rested his hands on the notebook he had placed on the table, the cover worn from years of being carried around. Rebecca's eyes flicked to it. What's in that notebook? Daniel hesitated before sliding it toward her. Memories, thoughts, regrets. I've been writing in it for years, trying to make sense of what happened, trying to put words to my guilt. I never planned on showing it to anyone, but if you want to see it, it's yours. Rebecca touched the cover with hesitant fingers. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she pushed it back toward him. Not today. Maybe later. I need to hear your voice, not just your words on paper. Daniel nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Fair enough. The clock struck noon, the chime echoing through the quiet reading room. Rebecca had checked her phone. I should get back to work. Deadlines don't wait. She stood, gathering her bag, but paused as Daniel rose too. Rebecca, he said softly, would it be all right if I saw you again? Not to dredge up the past every time, but just to share a coffee or a walk or a quiet moment. No expectations. She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. I don't make promises easily, but maybe I'll let you know. Daniel accepted that with a nod. I'll wait for your answer. They left the reading room together, the bookstore smelling of ink and rain-damp paper. Outside, the drizzle had softened into a mist, the streets glistening under the weak glow of the afternoon sun, trying to push through the clouds. Rebecca opened her umbrella, while Daniel simply tilted his face to the sky. Then the fine drops clinged to his skin. They parted at the corner of Lovejoy Street. Rebecca walked toward her office, her steps steady, but her mind swirling. Daniel stood watching her disappear into the crowd, his heart beating with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. That evening, in her apartment overlooking a narrow alley, Rebecca sat by the window with a glass of wine. She thought about the day, about the unexpected reunion, about the way his voice trembled when he spoke. She thought about the hospital, the loneliness, the years of silence, and for the first time in a long while, she wondered if letting him back into her life, even just a little, might help her breathe again. Meanwhile, Daniel checked into a modest hotel room downtown. He placed his satchel on the desk, pulled out the notebook, and flipped to a blank page. He stared at it for a long time before writing only one line. She gave me another chance to listen. Then he closed it and sat back, listening to the rain against the window. Portland's night fell slowly, streetlights glowing on wet pavement, cars sending ripples across puddles, the city humming its familiar tune. Somewhere in the Pearl District, Rebecca and Daniel were both wide awake, their minds restless, caught between a past they couldn't undo and a future neither dared to imagine. And so, the story of that rainy morning at the coffee shop was only the beginning of something neither of them had expected. The rain outside the cafe showed no sign of letting up. Drops beat against the glass with a rhythmic insistence, a steady percussion that filled the silences between Rebecca and Daniel. He sat across from her, his black coffee untouched, while she kept stirring her cappuccino, though the foam had long since dissolved. Neither of them seemed eager to break the fragile moment that hung between them. Finally, Rebecca exhaled, her voice quieter than she intended. I didn't expect to see you here, Daniel. Not after all this time. Daniel adjusted his glasses, as though the motion gave him a moment to steady himself. His eyes softened, the faint lines at their corners deepening with the weight of memory. I didn't expect it either. 12 years is a long time. Rebecca gave a half smile, the kind that hides more than it reveals. Some things feel longer than they really are. A group of students entered the cafe, their laughter and dripping umbrellas briefly disturbing the hushed atmosphere. They crowded around a table in the back, their chatter rising above the music, but soon the sound faded into the background again, leaving Rebecca and Daniel in their own secluded world. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I heard you stayed in Portland. I wasn't sure. I thought maybe you had gone back to Seattle. She shook her head. No, I stayed. I tried leaving once, but Portland has a way of keeping you, doesn't it? Daniel chuckled softly, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It does. Rain and all. Rebecca studied him carefully. His hair was flecked with gray now, his hands carrying a roughness that hadn't been there before. There was a weariness in his posture, a weight in his voice, and yet he was still undeniably the same man she had known in another life, another version of herself. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. "This cafe, this city after 12 years. Why now?" Daniel hesitated. He looked out the window for a moment, watching a cyclist struggle through the rain before speaking again. "I came back for work. But the truth is, I think I came back because of unfinished business." Her stomach tightened at his words. The air between them seemed to thicken, pressing down on her chest. Unfinished business was exactly what she had spent years trying to bury, convincing herself that the past had been sealed away like an old letter at the bottom of a drawer. And yet, here he was, pulling it back into the light with one sentence. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms defensively. "Unfinished business, Daniel? That's a dangerous phrase. You know what happened. You know why I left everything the way I did." His eyes searched hers, earnest and unwavering. "I know, but walking away didn't mean it disappeared." For a moment, Rebecca wanted to tell him to leave, to pick up his black coffee, and disappear back into the rain, as if he had never walked in that morning. But another part of her, a quieter and more fragile part, couldn't let him go just yet. Instead, she asked, "How long are you staying in Portland?" Daniel took a sip of his coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, then answered, "A few weeks, maybe longer, depending on how things go." Their silence returned, stretching over the table like an invisible cloth. Outside, the rain shifted from a steady fall to a heavier downpour, streaking the windows and darkening the street beyond. The world seemed blurred and distant, as though the cafe existed in its own separate pocket of time. Rebecca's laptop screen dimmed to black, forgotten. She folded her hands together, pressing her fingertips to her lips as though she could hold back the words gathering inside her. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever think about it? About that night?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. "Every day," he admitted. "I've tried to forget. I've tried to move on. But some things, they don't fade, Rebecca." Her throat tightened. She remembered the night vividly, too vividly. The way the air had smelled of rain even then. The way words had spilled out between them faster than they could catch them. The way everything had changed with one mistake, or perhaps one inevitability. "I built a life," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I had to. I couldn't keep holding on to something that couldn't exist." "And did it work?" Daniel asked quietly. She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came. The question lingered, cruel in its simplicity. Did it work? Did she manage to erase him, erase them? With routines, new people, and the endless passing of time, the silence that followed spoke louder than any answer could. Daniel reached across the table then, his hand hovering just a breath away from hers. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the nearness of it made her heart pound harder. "Rebecca," he said softly, "I'm not asking for the past back. I need to know if you ever felt what I felt, if it mattered to you too." She looked at him, at the rain-slick reflection of light in his glasses, at the quiet desperation in his eyes. Part of her wanted to lie, to push him away with words sharp enough to sever whatever thread still bound them. But the truth was right there, trembling in her chest, impossible to deny. "It mattered," she whispered, "more than I let myself admit." Daniel exhaled, a sound that was almost relief, almost sorrow. His hand finally lowered, resting against the edge of hers, the barest touch of skin to skin. It was nothing, and it was everything. At that exact moment, Oliver the barista called out an order, breaking the fragile stillness. A customer walked past their table, leaving a faint trail of damp air in their wake. The world intruded again, reminding them that they weren't alone, that their story was not unfolding in isolation. Rebecca pulled her hand back slowly, almost reluctantly. She forced herself to straighten her posture, to place the mask of composure back over her features. "This isn't the place," she said firmly. "Not here, not now." Daniel nodded, though disappointment flickered in his expression. "Then tell me where. Tell me when." Rebecca hesitated, her mind racing. The weight of 12 years pressed down on her shoulders. And yet, something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. "There's a park nearby," she said finally. "Jameson Square. Meet me there tomorrow, 10 in the morning, if the rain stops." His lips curved into a faint smile. "And if it doesn't?" She held his gaze. "Then maybe the rain isn't what matters." Daniel nodded again, more certain this time. He finished his coffee in one long swallow, grimacing at the bitterness once more, then stood. For a moment he lingered, as though afraid to leave her again after just finding her. But eventually he placed a gentle hand on the back of her chair and whispered, "Tomorrow, then." Rebecca didn't move as he left. She sat frozen, watching the door close behind him, listening to the faint jingle of the bell and the sound of rain swallowing him up outside. The cafe seemed quieter after he was gone, though the same music still played, the same students still laughed, the same barista still hummed while steaming milk. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. Rebecca finally let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She closed her laptop, untouched, and stared out at the rain-smeared street. Her reflection on the glass stared back at her, layered with streaks of water that made her look blurred, uncertain, almost like a stranger. Tomorrow, she thought. What would tomorrow bring? The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, as if the city itself was listening. The rain did not ease for the rest of that day. By the time Rebecca left Maple and Steam, the sidewalks had turned into shallow rivers, each puddle reflecting the glow of streetlights, even though it was only mid-afternoon. She pulled her coat tighter, her umbrella struggling against a gust of wind funneling down Northwest 13th Avenue. Her mind was still back at the cafe, replaying the look on Daniel's face, the tremor in his voice, the way her own heart had betrayed her composure. At home, her apartment on N.W. Everett Street felt colder than usual. She turned on a lamp, its warm light spilling over the books stacked on the coffee table. But even that couldn't chase away the unease that clung to her. She brewed another cup of coffee she didn't need and sat by the window, watching drops race each other down the glass. She told herself she should work, answer emails, finish editing the article she had promised her editor. But her fingers hovered above the keyboard without typing a single word. Instead, she remembered, 12 years ago, in a small studio apartment in Seattle, she and Daniel had shared something neither of them had intended. They were both different people then, reckless, searching, caught in the chaos of their 20s. She had been engaged at the time, though not happily, and Daniel had been her fiancé's closest friend. One night of honesty, too much wine, and a moment of weakness had set fire to boundaries that should have held. What followed was brief, hidden, and devastating. She left Seattle soon after, ending her engagement, severing ties with Daniel, burying it all under silence. For years, she told herself she had done the right thing. But seeing him that morning in Portland made her question everything again. The clock ticked toward midnight before she finally shut her laptop and went to bed. Sleep, however, came only in fragments, broken by dreams of rain-slicked streets and half-finished conversations. The next morning, Portland wore its familiar autumn coat of drizzle and mist. Rebecca dressed simply, dark jeans, a wool sweater, her hair pulled back into a loose knot. She hesitated before leaving the apartment, gripping the doorknob longer than necessary. She told herself she could still choose not to go. She could stay home, let the past slip back into shadow. But her feet carried her out the door, down the stairs, and toward Jameson Square. The park was quiet that hour. The fountain in the center, a series of stone steps that usually spill with water in summer, now stood dry, damp leaves scattered across its surface. The few people there were bundled in coats, walking dogs, or sipping from thermoses. Rebecca found a bench beneath a maple tree whose leaves had turned shades of copper and gold. She sat, her hands clasped together, her eyes scanning the paths. At 10:05, she saw him. Daniel approached from the north side, his coat buttoned, his stride steady though his expression betrayed a nervous edge. When he reached her, he paused, as if waiting for permission to sit. "You came," he said softly. "I said I would," she replied. He sat beside her, leaving a careful distance between them. For a while, neither spoke. They listened to the rustle of leaves, the muffled sound of traffic from nearby streets, the occasional bark of a dog. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Rebecca, I don't want to stir up pain, but I can't pretend it never happened. I can't keep carrying it alone." She turned toward him, her breath visible in the cool air. "I carried it too, Daniel. Don't think I didn't. I built walls around it, buried it so deep I thought it was gone. And then you walked into that cafe yesterday, and suddenly it all came back." He looked at her, his eyes earnest. "Then maybe it's time we stop burying it." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him that the past should remain untouched, that their lives had moved on. But part of her knew he was right. Secrets had a way of festering when left in the dark. Daniel lowered his voice, almost a whisper. "Do you regret it?" Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment. The question cut deep, demanding an honesty she wasn't sure she could give. When she opened them again, the park seemed sharper, the wet sheen on the benches, the vibrant leaves against gray sky, the faint drizzle cooling her cheeks. "I regret the hurt it caused," she said carefully. "I regret the lies. But what we felt, no, I don't regret that." Daniel's breath caught, a faint sound of relief mixed with sorrow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I loved you, Rebecca. I never told you, not then. I couldn't, but I did, and I think part of me still does." Her heart clenched. She wanted to tell him to stop, that it was too late, that love declared after 12 years had no place in their lives. Yet she couldn't, because the truth was, she had loved him too, in her own quiet, guilty way. "Daniel," she began, her voice shaking, "we can't undo the years. We can't go back. You know that." "I don't want to go back," he replied firmly. "I just want to know where we stand now, what this means after all this time." Before she could answer, a sudden gust of wind shook the branches overhead, scattering leaves around them like fragments of fire. Rebecca reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against his. Neither of them pulled away. For a moment, they sat in silence, their fingers barely touching, the world narrowing to that small point of connection. A dog barked nearby, jolting Rebecca back. She withdrew her hand, pressing it into her lap. "This is dangerous," she murmured. "We're not the same people anymore. You don't know who I am now, and I don't know who you are." Daniel looked at her steadily. "Then let me know. Let's find out, instead of running from it." Her pulse raced. She should have said no. She should have ended it there, stood up and walked away. But instead, she found herself nodding. "Maybe, but slowly, Daniel. If we open this door again, we do it carefully. No more mistakes." He smiled faintly, a mixture of hope and restraint. "Carefully, then. That's enough for me." They sat together until the drizzle thickened into rain. People hurried to the park, umbrellas opening like dark blossoms. Rebecca finally stood, pulling her coat tighter. "I should go," she said. "Can I walk you home?" Daniel asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. Not today, but maybe another time. Daniel nodded, accepting her decision. He didn't press. Instead, he simply said, "I'll be here whenever you're ready." Rebecca turned and walked toward her street, the sound of rain mingling with the distant hum of the city. She didn't look back, though she felt his eyes following her until she disappeared around the corner, back in her apartment. She sat once more by the window, her coat still damp, her hair clinging to her face. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the rain-blurred city beyond the glass. For the first time in years, the walls she built around her heart felt less certain, less solid. Tomorrow seemed uncertain, terrifying, and yet alive. The rain continued its steady rhythm, as though keeping her secret, as though urging her forward into something she was no longer sure she could resist. The next few days in Portland followed a pattern of rain, mist, and fleeting moments of sunlight that broke through only long enough to tease the city before disappearing again. Rebecca found herself moving through her routines, as if in a dream. She went to work at the magazine's office, answered emails, attended meetings, and edited articles, but her mind constantly strayed to Daniel. Everywhere she went, she noticed the city differently now. The bridges stretching over the Willamette looked heavier under the clouds, the bookstores in the Pearl District more inviting, the smell of roasted coffee beans on every corner sharper than before. It was as if Portland itself was conspiring to keep her awake, to remind her that her past had returned and demanded attention. 3 days after their meeting at Jameson Square, Daniel sent her a short message. He had found her number somehow. She suspected through a mutual acquaintance, though she didn't ask. The message was simple. "There's an art exhibit at the Portland Art Museum this weekend. Would you like to go?" She stared at the text for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard as she debated whether to respond. Part of her screamed no, reminding her of the dangers, the complications, the long shadow of regret. But another part of her, the part she had tried to silence for years, whispered yes. She finally typed back, Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. The museum was quiet that day, the rain keeping most people indoors. Rebecca wore a charcoal coat and carried her umbrella, though the walk from her apartment to the entrance was only a few blocks. She arrived early, hoping to compose herself before seeing him. The wide marble steps gleamed with wetness, and the glass doors reflected her image as she waited. When Daniel appeared, he looked slightly out of breath, his hair damp from the drizzle. He smiled, tentative but warm, and greeted her with a quiet hi. "Hi," she replied, her voice soft. They entered the museum together. The galleries were filled with the muted hush of footsteps and the occasional murmur of visitors. They wandered through the exhibit slowly, pausing at paintings and sculptures, though neither seemed truly absorbed by the art. Their attention remained fixed on each other, on the delicate thread of conversation weaving between them. At one painting, a stormy seascape of waves crashing against dark rocks, Rebecca stopped longer than usual. Daniel came to stand beside her. "It feels familiar, doesn't it?" he said. She tilted her head, studying the chaos on the canvas. "Yes, like standing in the middle of something too big to fight, too powerful to escape." He glanced at her, and for a moment, she knew he wasn't talking about the painting. They moved on, the silence between them thick, but not unbearable. After an hour, they found a bench in one of the quieter rooms, where light from a skylight fell in soft beams across the polished floor. They sat side by side, not touching, yet aware of each other in every breath. Daniel finally spoke. "I've thought about what you said at the park, about being careful. I want that too. I don't want to hurt you. Rebecca, I can't let us vanish again without knowing if there's something worth holding on to." Her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know what I can give you, Daniel. My life now is different. I've worked hard to keep it steady. And I'm not asking you to break it apart, he said quickly. I only want to be in it, even if it's just as a friend for now. She looked at him then, his expression so open, so sincere that her chest ached. She remembered how he used to look at her all those years ago, with the same intensity, the same patience. The years hadn't erased that. Friends, she echoed, testing the word. It felt fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of a table. All right, we can try. They left the museum together, the rain having eased into a fine mist. Outside, the city glistened, the streets shining like silver ribbons under the weak afternoon light. Daniel walked with her until they reached the corner near her apartment. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For giving me a chance. She didn't answer, only offered a small nod before turning away. But once inside her apartment, she leaned against the door, her heart racing. A chance. That was what she had given him. And herself. The days that followed unfolded gently. They began meeting more often. Sometimes at small cafes tucked into quiet streets. Sometimes at Powell's Books where they wandered among endless shelves. Sometimes simply walking along the riverfront with cups of coffee warming their hands. Their conversations ranged from the ordinary, work, books, the weather, to the deeper questions they had avoided for years. One evening, they sat on a bench overlooking the river, the city lights reflecting in rippling gold across the dark water. The air was crisp, their breaths visible. Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if things had gone differently? Daniel asked. All the time, Rebecca admitted. But wondering doesn't change anything. No, he said, but it makes me realize how much I still want to know you, who you are now, not just who you were. She smiled faintly, her eyes on the lights dancing across the river. Then asked me, one question at a time. And so he did. He asked about her favorite books now, her morning rituals, the places she went when she needed to think. She asked him about his travels, the people he had met, the ways his life had changed. Each answer was a step closer, a bridge built carefully across the years that had once separated them. Yet beneath the growing comfort, tension lingered. There were moments when her hands brushed accidentally, when their eyes met too long, when silence carried weight heavier than words. Both felt the pull, both resisted it, and both knew resistance could not last forever. One rainy night, as they left a small jazz bar on Alberta Street, Daniel offered to walk Rebecca home. The streets were slick with rain, the neon lights of storefronts glowing on the pavement. They walked in silence, the sound of rain filling the spaces between them. When they reached her apartment door, Rebecca hesitated. Do you want to come in for a cup of tea? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel's answer was immediate. Yes. Inside, the apartment was warm. The air scented faintly with chamomile from a candle she had lit earlier. She set water to boil while Daniel removed his coat, draping it over a chair. They moved carefully, as if aware of the line they were approaching. When she handed him a steaming mug, their fingers touched, lingering a moment longer than necessary. The air between them thickened, charged with everything unspoken. Rebecca, Daniel began, his voice low, I don't want to ruin this, but I can't pretend I don't feel it. Not anymore. She set her mug down, her hands trembling. I feel it too, she whispered. The silence that followed was not empty but full. Overflowed with the weight of years, the pull of desire, the fear of repeating old mistakes. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. The rain outside fell harder, drumming against the windows, as if echoing the storm within them both. And for the first time in 12 years, neither of them looked away. The rain outside had grown heavier, blurring the windows of the small Portland coffee shop until the world beyond looked like a watercolor painting that had been left out too long in the drizzle. Inside, though, there was warmth, Soft amber light from the old hanging lamps above, the hum of conversations, and the hiss of the espresso machine like a steady background heartbeat. Sarah sat at her corner table, her notebook open but untouched, a pencil resting across the page as though she had set it down mid-thought. Across from her, David leaned forward with his elbows on the table, his jacket still damp from the walk over, a faint trace of rain on his dark hair. Their cups had long cooled, the steam gone, leaving behind a faint aroma of roasted beans and milk foam. They had been speaking in circles for almost an hour. At times, their voices dropped low, nearly drowned out by the grinding of coffee beans. At other times, there were long silences where only the rain filled the space between them. "I just don't understand," Sarah whispered finally, her eyes not meeting his. She traced her fingertip along the rim of her mug, the movement slow, almost nervous. "Why now? Why here?" David exhaled, shifting uncomfortably, because it couldn't wait anymore. He paused, watching her, his words seeming to weigh him down as much as they unsettled her. "If I didn't say something today, I don't think I ever would." There was a crackle of tension between them, unspoken but heavy. The barista behind the counter called out another order, sliding a plate of pastries onto the polished wood, but the world around him felt distant, like a play running in the background of their private scene. The door opened again, and a gust of cold, damp air swept him along with a man in his 40s wearing a soaked trench coat. He shook the rain off like a dog before moving toward the counter. Sarah glanced up briefly, her gaze flicking to him, but her thoughts quickly returned to the table in front of her. David lowered his voice. "Do you remember the last time we were in here together? It was, what? 4 years ago." She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You were about to leave for London, and I was trying not to think about what it meant." A half smile touched his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I thought it was the last time I'd see you. That morning, I almost said something then, but I didn't. I walked out, got on that plane, and tried to bury it." Her heart tightened. The memory came back with startling clarity. The sound of his laughter that morning, the way his hand had brushed hers when they reached for the same sugar packet, the unspoken weight that had lingered between them even as they pretended it wasn't there. "David," she said quietly, shaking her head, "things are different now. You can't just walk back in and say all this like the years in between didn't happen." He leaned back, his chair creaking softly. "I know, but when I saw you again last week, when I realized you still come here, still sit in this exact corner like nothing's changed, it felt like the universe was giving me one more chance." The rain hammered harder against the windows, making the whole shop feel like a cocoon sealed away from the city beyond. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing through memories she had long locked away, the kind she told herself she'd outgrown. Before she could answer, the man in the trench coat turned from the counter, balancing his coffee. His gaze swept over the shop, and for a moment it lingered on Sarah and David's table. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, curiosity, maybe suspicion. Sarah noticed and felt a shiver creep up her spine. David noticed too. He lowered his voice further. "Do you know him?" Sarah's throat tightened. I'm not sure." She looked away quickly, but the unease remained. The man sat 2 tables over, close enough that Sarah could feel his presence, though he busied himself with his coffee and phone. Still, there was something about him, something watchful. David reached across the table, his hand brushing hers just lightly enough that it could be mistaken for accident. "Look, I didn't come here to make things harder for you. I just needed to tell you. I needed you to know that He stopped himself, his jaw tightening, that I never really moved on." Her breath caught, and for a moment she forgot about the stranger nearby, the rain outside, even the passage of time. It was just his words and the way they brought back every buried feeling she had tried to silence. The bell above the door jingled again, and another customer entered shaking off an umbrella. The shop filled with the smell of wet wool and roasted coffee beans. The sound of chairs scraping lightly across the wooden floor. Life went on around them, oblivious to the storm brewing quietly at their table. Sarah finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You don't know what you're asking of me." David's expression was unreadable. "Maybe not, but I had to take the risk." As silence settled again, the man in the trench coat glanced their way once more, his gaze sharp now, not casual. Sarah shifted in her seat, uncomfortable under the weight of it. She whispered, "David, I think we're being watched." David's eyes followed hers, his jaw tightening. He leaned closer across the table, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Then maybe this is bigger than just us." The rain outside seemed to intensify, as though punctuated his words. The coffee shop, once cozy and safe, now felt like the center of something neither of them had fully grasped. And Sarah realized, as her fingers tightened around her untouched pencil, that whatever had brought David back into her life, that rainy morning in Portland, was only the beginning of a story that hadn't yet revealed its full weight. The clock on the wall ticked softly above them, each second stretching longer than it should, as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The clock above the counter ticked louder in Sarah's mind than it did in reality. Each second seemed stretched thin, like the air inside the coffee shop had thickened and slowed. She tried to steady her breath, but the unease wouldn't let go. Her gaze flickered again toward the man in the trench coat, who had now placed his phone face down on the table and was stirring his coffee with deliberate slowness. It wasn't just casual observation anymore. He was listening. David leaned closer, his hand brushing the notebook that lay open in front of her. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper. "Don't look at him again. Just listen to me." Sarah swallowed hard. "You're scaring me." "I'm not trying to," he murmured. "But I don't think it's a coincidence that he's here. Not today. Not while we're talking about this." The words sank into her like cold water. She thought back to the past week, to the messages that had come from an unknown number, brief and unsettling. "We know where you go. We know who you meet." She had dismissed them as spam or a cruel joke. But now, sitting across from David, feeling the stranger's gaze burn into the side of her face, she wasn't so sure. The rain outside had softened, no longer a furious downpour, but a steady, rhythmic patter that filled the silence between their words. People came and went, huddling in coats and scarves, umbrellas dripping, ordering lattes and muffins, as though nothing unusual was happening. The world moved on, indifferent, while Sarah felt trapped in a moment that was growing heavier by the second. "Why would anyone care about us?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep calm. David hesitated, his eyes locked on hers. Then he leaned back, his jaw tense. "Because of what I did before I left Portland. Because of what I was involved in." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her. She remembered the rumors that had swirled around his sudden departure. Whispers about debts, about a fight that had ended badly, about connections of people better left unnamed. She had never asked, never wanted to know, but now the weight of those unasked questions pressing on her. Before she could respond, the man in the trench coat stood. The scrape of his chair against the wooden floor cut through the murmur of conversation. He carried his coffee toward the exit, his gaze flicking once more to their table as he passed. This time, Sarah caught it fully, sharp, assessing like a silent warning. Then he was gone, the bell above the door chiming softly as he disappeared into the gray morning outside. David exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. "That's not over," he muttered. He wasn't just some stranger. Sarah pressed her palms flat against the table, grounding herself. "Then tell me the truth. All of it. Right now." For a long moment, David didn't answer. The barista called out another order. Someone laughed near the counter. and the door opened to let in a blast of cold air and two students shaking off the rain. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, like they were in two overlapping realities, one safe and ordinary, the other shadowed and threatening. Finally, David leaned forward again. When I left for London, it wasn't just because of work. I was running. There were people who wanted something from me, something I had, and I couldn't give it up. I thought putting an ocean between us would keep everyone safe, including you. Sarah's throat tightened. Safe from what? From the kind of men who send people like him, David said, his voice grim. The words hummed between them, heavy and unavoidable. Sarah gripped her pencil tighter, though she didn't know why. It was just a piece of wood and graphite, fragile and useless against whatever invisible force had just brushed against their lives. David, she whispered, why come back now? Why risk dragging me into this after all this time? He looked at her with an intensity that made her chest ache. Because I couldn't stay away anymore. Because everything I've done to stay alive has led me back here. To you. Her heart twisted, torn between anger and longing, between fear and the undeniable pull of something she had never fully let go. Outside, the man in the trench coat stood across the street under the awning of a bookstore, his figure barely visible through the rain-speckled glass. Sarah's eyes widened as she recognized him again. He's still there, she said, her voice shaking. David turned, his jaw tightening when he spotted the man lingering in the shadows. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair and pulled it on quickly. We can't stay here. Where are we supposed to go? Sarah asked, panic rising in her chest. Somewhere crowded. Somewhere harder to follow us, he said. But first, we need to leave through the side door, not the front. The coffee shop suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. Sarah gathered her notebook and slipped it into her bag with trembling hands. The ordinary chatter of the cafe now sounded distant, like it belonged to another world entirely. David stood, steady and focused. Stay close to me. They wove between tables, the scent of fresh pastries and roasted coffee clinging to the air as though mocking the danger building around them. At the far end of the shop, near the restrooms, a narrow exit led to an alley. David pushed it open, holding it long enough for Sarah to slip through before following her out. The alley smelled of wet concrete and garbage, the walls glistening with rainwater. Puddles reflected the dim gray light. David checked both directions quickly, then took her hand. His grip was firm, reassuring despite the chaos swirling around them. Left, he said, and they moved swiftly, their footsteps splashing against the uneven pavement. The city around them seemed sharper now. The sound of car tires on wet asphalt, the distant honk of a horn, the echo of their hurried steps. Sarah glanced over her shoulder and thought she saw a figure turn into the alley from the other end. But David urged her forward before she could look again. Don't stop, he whispered. They emerged onto a busier street, where umbrellas bobbed like floating mushrooms in the steady rain. The ordinary bustle of Portland life continued. People waiting at crosswalks, a street musician strumming under an awning, cyclists weaving carefully between cars. For a moment, it almost felt normal again. Almost. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the trench coat was still somewhere nearby, watching. They ducked into another cafe 2 blocks away, this one larger and more crowded. The air inside was warmer, filled with the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread. David guided her to a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the room constantly. Sarah leaned across the table, her voice urgent. Tell me what they want from you. Tell me what this is really about. David's hands curled into fists on the table. It's about something I took before I left. Something valuable. Not money, not jewelry. Information. Documents that weren't supposed to see daylight. And if they think I still have them... His words trailed off as the door to the cafe opened. Sarah's breath caught when she saw the trench coat again, dark and heavy, dripping rainwater onto the polished floor. David muttered under his breath, "It's not over. Not yet." The storm outside no longer felt like the only storm in Portland. The rain beat harder against the windows, and Sarah realized that this morning, what had started as an awkward reunion over coffee had become something far more dangerous, something that was only just beginning to unfold. The man moved slowly through the crowd, his eyes scanning, his steps deliberate, and Sarah knew with a sinking feeling that there would be no easy way out of what was coming. The cafe that David and Sarah had slipped into was buzzing with chatter, the clink of cups, and the rustle of coats shaken free of rain. Yet despite the warmth, despite the crowd that should have offered them some safety, Sarah felt a chill that refused to leave her skin. Her eyes never left the man in the trench coat as he moved slowly past the counter, his damp shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. David leaned closer across the booth, his jaw tight. "Stay calm," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the noise around them. "We're not leaving until I say so." Sarah tried to focus on her breathing. In, out, in, out. The cinnamon-sweet air of the cafe mixed with the bitter scent of coffee grounds, grounding her just enough to stop her hands from shaking. She opened her bag and pulled out her notebook, pretending to write anything to make herself look like another ordinary customer. The man ordered something at the counter, his voice too low to make out. He didn't turn his head toward them, not directly, but Sarah could feel the weight of his awareness. He was there for them, there was no doubt now. David's gaze was fixed, his eyes scanning every reflection in the mirrors behind the counter, every shadow that moved. He had the look of someone who had lived this tension before, who had been hunted long enough to read the signs. When the man finally collected his drink, he didn't sit. He lingered near the window instead, sipping slowly, his posture relaxed but his gaze restless. Every so often his eyes swept across the cafe, and once, just once, they locked on Sarah's. It was a brief connection, but it carried intent. She quickly looked down at her notebook, scribbling nonsense words just to keep her hands moving. David noticed. He slid his hand across the table and squeezed hers briefly. "We'll leave through the back again," he whispered. "Not yet. Let him think we're settled in." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The rain outside had softened into a mist, the kind of drizzle that clung to coats and blurred the glow of the street lamps. Through the window, Sarah could see cars passing slowly, their headlights carving pale paths through the fog. Portland looked almost beautiful from inside, almost peaceful, but the peace felt false. Finally, David stood. "Restroom," he said aloud, as though to anyone listening, before slipping away from the booth. Sarah's heart lurched. She didn't like being left alone, not with the trench coat man still there. She forced herself to breathe, to focus on her notebook, until she caught something in her peripheral vision. The man had moved. He was no longer by the window. Her pulse quickened. She scanned the cafe desperately until she saw him. Closer now, standing near the pastry display, pretending to look at croissants. But his eyes weren't on the food. They were on her. The minutes dragged. Then, relief, David returned, sliding back into the booth. He set his phone on the table and spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. "Back door's clear. We go now." They moved quickly but without drawing attention, weaving past tables, coats brushing their shoulders, the air filled with the rich scent of ground beans and baked bread. Sarah's hand gripped her bag tight as they slipped through the narrow hall toward the rear exit. The door creaked as David pushed it open, and cold mist rushed in to greet them. Outside, the alley was quieter than the last one they had escaped through. The drizzle had turned the pavement into a slick, reflective surface, catching faint neon glows from the bars down the street. A garbage truck rumbled in the distance, its sound muffled by the damp air. David kept a firm hold on her wrist, leading her quickly toward the main road. "Don't look back," he whispered. But Sarah couldn't help it. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. The man was there, stepping out a cafe's back door, his trench coat flaring slightly as he scanned the alley. His eyes found them almost immediately. "David!" Sarah gasped. "Run," David said, his voice sharp. They sprinted, their footsteps echoing against brick walls and puddles splashing underfoot. Sarah's breath came in ragged bursts, the mist turning her hair damp, her lungs burning as they turned a corner and darted onto a busier street. The sudden rush of people was disorienting. Umbrellas jostling, headlights flashing, the honk of cars as pedestrians spilled into crosswalks. David pulled her through the chaos, weaving them into the crowd until they reached a bus stop. A bus was just pulling up, its brakes squealing against the wet road. "On," David ordered. They climbed aboard, the warm air inside thick with the smell of damp coats and diesel. Sarah dropped into a seat by the window, her chest heaving, while David stood near the door, scanning the street outside as the bus pulled away. For a moment, she thought they were safe. The city lights blurred past, raindrops chasing each other down the window. People around them chatted casually, oblivious to the chase unfolding just beyond their awareness. But then she saw him again. The man in the trench coat stood at the corner they had just left, watching the bus pull away. His figure grew smaller in the distance, but the certainty settled deep in her gut. He wasn't going to stop. David sat beside her finally, his expression grim. He'll follow. Maybe not tonight, maybe not on foot, but he won't stop. Not until he is what he's after. Sarah turned to him, her voice unsteady. "And what is it he thinks you still have?" David hesitated, as though weighing whether to trust her with the truth. Then he leaned in close. "It's not just paper, Sarah. It's proof. Proof of things people with power will do anything to hide. When I left, I thought I was saving us both by keeping it buried. But somehow they know I'm back. And now you're in it too." Her heart pounded, her thoughts tumbling. She looked out the window again, the rain-slicked streets glowing under neon signs and headlights, and felt the city shift around her. Portland had always been familiar, her safe corner of the world. But tonight, it had turned into a labyrinth, full of shadows and eyes that watched too closely. The bus rattled on, carrying them further from the coffee shop where it had all begun. Yet the feeling didn't fade. Sarah knew this was no longer about a single rainy morning or a single conversation. It was about something far larger, something she hadn't chosen, but now couldn't escape. David's hand closed gently over hers again, grounding her. His voice was steady, though his eyes carried the weight of years of secrets. "No matter what happens next, I need you to trust me." She looked at him, torn between anger, fear, and the echo of the love she had never let go. "And if I can't?" His answer was quiet but firm. "Then we're already lost." The bus rolled on into the night, rain streaking the windows, the city unfolding ahead like a map of uncertainty. Somewhere behind them, in the fog and the lights, the man in the trench coat waited, patient and relentless. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool glass and realized the storm had only just begun. The bus rolled steadily through Portland streets, the steady drizzle streaking the windows like lines on a page. Sarah's reflection wavered in the glass, her own eyes looking back at her, wide and uncertain, as if she were a character in someone else's story. The hum of the engine and the murmurs of passengers made the atmosphere strangely calm compared to the racing of her heart. David sat next to her, his gaze fixed on the dark streets beyond, shoulders tense like a spring wound too tight. Every stop the bus made felt like a test. Each time the door hissed open and strangers climbed aboard, Sarah half expected to see the trench coat step in, water dripping from its heavy hem, his watchful eyes searching the rows. Each time, relief washed through her when it didn't happen. Yet she knew, deep down, he wasn't far. After 20 minutes, David tapped her arm gently. "Next stop we get off," he said quietly. Sarah turned to him. "Do you even know where we're going?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Not exactly. But we can't stay in motion forever. I know a place, someone I can trust. Just don't ask too many questions yet." The bus slowed with a squeal of brakes. They stepped out into a quieter part of the city, where the streetlights glowed weakly through mist and storefronts were shuttered for night. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked asphalt and with smoke from a nearby chimney. Sarah pulled her coat tighter, her notebook pressing uncomfortably against her side inside the bag. "Where are we?" she asked. "Near Hawthorne," David replied, scanning the street. His eyes darted constantly, reading shadows, doorways, and corners as though every one of them could hide a threat. "Come on. It's a few blocks from here." They walked quickly, their footsteps splashing in shallow puddles. The neighborhood felt older, lined with trees that dripped rain onto the cracked sidewalks. The occasional car rolled past, headlights slicing to the fog, but otherwise, the streets were quiet. Too quiet. Sarah's mind churned as they moved. She wanted to demand more answers about the documents, about the people chasing them, about what exactly he had dragged her into, but the urgency in his stride kept her silent. Finally, they reached a narrow brick building tucked between a laundromat and a bookstore. Its windows were dark except for a faint glow behind heavy curtains on the second floor. David pulled her toward the side entrance, where an old metal staircase clung to the wall. They climbed quickly, the iron groaning under their weight, until they reached a door at the top. David knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. A coded rhythm. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the sound of bolts sliding back echoed faintly, and the door opened just enough for a face to peer out. A man in his early 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes, studied them. "David," he said flatly, "I thought you were done with this city." "Not exactly," David replied. "Can we come in?" The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to Sarah. "Who's she?" "She's with me," David said firmly. "Please, Robert, just for tonight." Robert exhaled, clearly reluctant, but he opened the door wider. "Get in before someone sees you." Inside, the air was warmer, carrying the faint scent of old books and tobacco. The apartment was cluttered but lived in. Stacks of newspapers, maps pinned to the walls, a record player in the corner. Robert bolted the door behind them, then turned sharply. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. David ran a hand through his damp hair. "I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," Robert snapped. Then his gaze softened slightly as he looked at Sarah. "Does she even know what she's caught up in?" Sarah felt her stomach twist. "Not enough," she admitted. "But I think it's time someone told me." Robert shot David a hard look. "You didn't tell her?" "I was going to," David muttered. "But then they found us at the cafe." Robert cursed under his breath, pacing to the window and pulling the curtain back just enough to glance outside. "They don't just stumble onto you by accident. If they're here, it means they've been watching for a while." Sarah stepped closer, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Who are they?" Robert turned, his expression grim. "People with more power than you can imagine. Men who build their empires in the shadows and destroy anyone who threatens to expose them. And your friend here," he jabbed a finger at David, "stole something they want buried." David's voice was low but resolute. "I didn't steal it. I took evidence. Proof of what they did, of who they really are." Sarah stared at him. "What kind of proof?" David met her eyes. "Names, dates, transactions, files that show how deep their corruption runs. If it ever saw the light of day, it could bring down more than just a few powerful men. It could unravel entire systems." Robert leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Which is why they'll never stop hunting you." And now her. The words sank into Sarah like stones, heavy and unavoidable. She thought of the trench coat man, of the way his eyes had followed them, patient and unyielding. She realized then that this wasn't something that would fade if she ignored it. She was entangled, whether she wanted to be or not. A knock echoed suddenly at the door, sharp and deliberate. The three of them froze. Robert's eyes darted to David. "Did anyone see you come here?" "No," David said quickly. The knock came again, louder this time. Sarah's heart pounded, her throat tight. She clutched her bag instinctively, as if her notebook could shield her from what was outside. Robert moved silently to a drawer, pulling out a small handgun. He gestured for silence. The apartment seemed to hold its breath as he approached the door, standing to the side before calling out, "Who is it?" Silence. The knock came again, softer now, almost mocking. David's jaw tightened. "It's him." Robert cursed under his breath. "Back room. Now." He motioned for Sarah and David to move quickly, ushering them into a narrow hallway that led to a small study cluttered with books and files. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as Robert shut the door behind them. From the other side, the knocking grew insistent. Then came the faint rattle of the doorknob. Sarah pressed back against the wall, her breath shallow. "David, what if he gets in?" David's hand found hers, his grip steady despite the tension in his eyes. "Then we don't let him take what he came for." The words made Sarah's blood run cold, because she suddenly understood this wasn't just about the files David carried in his memory. It was about everyone connected to them. And now, she was one of those connections. The rattling stopped. For a moment, there was silence, then the sound of footsteps retreating down the metal stairs. Robert opened the study door a crack, listening, before muttering, "He'll be back. They always come back." David exhaled slowly, though the tension never left his shoulders. "Then we don't wait for him. We move before they tighten the net." Robert looked at him like he was mad. "Move where? They've got eyes everywhere." "Not everywhere," David said. "There are still places they don't control. Places we can vanish." Sarah's chest tightened. "And then what?" "We just run forever." David looked at her, his eyes tired but burning with something fierce. "Not forever. Just long enough to decide whether we're going to keep running or fight back." The weight of his words filled the room. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and endless, as though the city itself was bearing witness to the storm gathering inside. Sarah realized then that whatever path lay ahead, the quiet safety of her old life was gone. That rainy morning in Portland had cracked open a door she could never close again. And somewhere in the fog-drenched streets below, the man in the trench coat waited, relentless and patient, knowing the game was only beginning. The rain outside had not stopped, and the city seemed to lean deeper into its grayness as the morning stretched closer to noon. The cafe remained warm, lit by soft amber bulbs that reflected in the sheen of wet tables by the window. Rebecca and Daniel sat across from each other, their cups untouched now, the steam having long since vanished into the air. Their conversation had slowed, not because they had run out of things to say, but because so much lingered unspoken between them. Rebecca's fingers traced absent circles on the rim of her coffee cup. Her mind flickered back to the days when she and Daniel had first met. It was 2010, in a small university town near the coast. She remembered walking into a literature seminar, nervous and unsure of herself, and there he had been, confident, witty, and already known by half the room. He had been the kind of man people noticed, and yet, somehow, he had noticed her. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the leather strap of his satchel still across his chest. His eyes studied her carefully, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the memory of the younger Rebecca he once knew. Lines of time marked his face now, but there was a steadiness to him that hadn't been there before. I never thought I'd see you here, he said finally, his voice quiet enough to be drowned out by the hiss of milk frothing behind the counter. Rebecca looked out the window for a moment. The rain was heavier now, blurring the outlines of buildings and street signs. People hurried by, coats clutched tightly, heads bowed against the drizzle. Portland wasn't part of my plan, she admitted softly. But life has a way of putting us in places we never expected to be. He smiled faintly at that, but his eyes held a seriousness she remembered well. You disappeared back then. No calls, no letters, nothing. I tried to find you. Her chest tightened. The weight of old choices pressed against her ribs. I know, she whispered, and I'm sorry, but things were complicated. The word hung in the air, heavy and unfinished. Complicated. It was a word that covered years of silence, choices that fractured their bond, and the guilt that neither of them had ever fully confronted. The barista, Oliver, called out an order for a customer near the counter. The clinking of cups, the rustle of coats, the muted sound of rain against glass, all filled the silence between them. Daniel reached for his coffee, now lukewarm, and took a sip as though buying himself a moment. You could have told me, he said. His tone was calm, but beneath it lay something raw. Whatever it was, I would have listened. I would have understood. Rebecca shook her head. No, you wouldn't have. Not then. She met his gaze, her eyes steady now. You had your path, Daniel, and I had mine. If I had told you everything, it would have changed the way you saw me forever. A pause stretched long between them. She knew he wanted to ask what she meant, but she also knew he was afraid of the answer. Finally, Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. Rebecca, what really happened back then? Her throat felt dry. She wanted to speak, to explain, but the words caught inside her. Memories of long nights, hidden letters, and decisions made in fear resurfaced like ghosts pressing against the window pane of her mind. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. I need some air, she said, her voice breaking. She reached for her coat, pulling it tightly around her as she moved toward the door. Daniel sat frozen for a second, then pushed his own chair back and followed her. Outside, the rain hit harder, soaking through coats and hair within minutes. Rebecca walked quickly down the street, past bookshops and boutiques with fog windows, her footsteps splashing in shallow puddles. Rebecca, wait, Daniel called, his voice cutting through the sound of rain. She stopped at the corner, under the awning of a flower shop where buckets of rain-drenched roses and lilies leaned against the glass. She turned to face him, water dripping from her hair, her cheeks pale against the gray morning. You want to know what happened? She asked, her voice trembling. I left because I was afraid. Not of you, but of what was coming. Daniel stood a few steps away, his coat plastered to his frame, his hair darkened by the rain. Afraid of what? She drew in a breath, her hands trembling as she pushed wet strands of hair from her face. Afraid of the truth. Afraid that if you knew everything, you'd hate me. And I couldn't live with that. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, the only sound between them was a steady rhythm of rain on the awning above. Daniel took a slow step closer. Rebecca, whatever it is, it can't be worse than silence. Tell me, please. Her eyes filled with tears, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She wanted to speak, to tell him the truth that had haunted her for over a decade, but fear clamped down on her throat once more. Instead, she whispered, not here, not now. And with that, she turned and began walking again, leaving Daniel standing in the rain, watching her fade into the gray blur of Portland's morning. The city around them carried on as if nothing had changed. Cars moved through intersections, coffee shops filled with chatter, umbrellas bobbed along the sidewalks. But for Rebecca and Daniel, The world had shifted. The past had caught up with them, and the answers they had avoided for so long were pressing closer with each step. Yet the truth remained unspoken, hovering in the damp air, waiting for the moment when she would finally let it out. The rain fell harder, sheets of water sliding down the awning above the flower shop. Rebecca's shoes were already soaked, her coat clinging uncomfortably to her arms, but she didn't seem to notice. She stood there, staring at the street as if it might somehow swallow her up and save her from having to answer the questions that lingered in Daniel's eyes. Daniel approached carefully, his steps slow, deliberate. He didn't want to push her, but he also knew he couldn't let her disappear again. 12 years had passed, and yet, standing there in the rain, it felt as though no time had gone by at all. The old ache returned, questions unanswered, a hollow space left behind when she had vanished without explanation. Rebecca pulled her coat tighter and finally spoke, her voice low but clear despite the noise of passing cars. I should never have come back here. Running into you was the last thing I wanted. Daniel's chest tightened at her words, though his voice remained calm. Then why are you here, Rebecca? Why Portland? Why today of all days? She shook her head, her wet hair plastering itself against her cheeks. It doesn't matter. I can't go back to the past, Daniel. I can't undo it. He stepped closer, until the space between them was only a breath. His eyes searched hers, desperate for answers. You don't have to undo it. You just have to tell me the truth. What was it you were so afraid of? Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again, as though the words were too heavy to release. Instead, she turned away and began walking down the sidewalk again, weaving between strangers with umbrellas. Daniel followed. They walked in silence for several blocks, the city alive around them. Buses hissing as they pulled to stops, bicycles splashing through puddles, the muted glow of neon signs flickering through the mist. Eventually, they reached a quieter street lined with brick buildings, the kind that seemed to have stood for over a century. Rebecca stopped in front of a small bookstore with fogged-up windows and stacks of second-hand novels pressed against the glass. She ducked inside without a word, the bell above the door chiming softly. Daniel hesitated for a moment before pushing in after her. The shop smelled of paper and dust, the air dry compared to the wet chill outside. A heater hummed somewhere in the corner, adding a faint warmth. Rebecca moved quickly down one of the aisles, finally stopping near the poetry section. She rested her hand against a shelf, her shoulders trembling slightly. Daniel stayed a few feet back, giving her space but refusing to leave. After a long silence, she finally spoke. When I left, I wasn't just leaving you. I was leaving everything behind. My studies, my family, my friends, all of it. I was running from something I didn't know how to face. Daniel's voice was steady, though there was a faint tremor beneath it. What was it? Her fingers brushed across the spines of old books, stopping on a faded volume of Sylvia Plath. She pulled out, not to read, but simply to hold. Her knuckles whitened around the edges. I was pregnant, Daniel. The word struck him harder than any blow could have. For a moment, the hum of the heater and the soft murmur of customers somewhere in the back of the shop disappeared. He heard only the echo of her confession. His throat tightened. You were pregnant? She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. I didn't know what to do. We were so young, and you had your future ahead of you. You're already making plans, talking about internships and moving to the city. I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I thought it would ruin everything for you. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. So you left? Without saying a word. Rebecca swallowed hard. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I disappeared, you could go on without the burden of me and the child. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. 12 years of confusion and longing suddenly given shape. yet leaving him more hollow than before. Finally, he forced the question past his lips. "What happened to the baby?" Rebecca closed her eyes, her face tightening with grief. "A girl. Her name is Emily. She's 11 now." Daniel's breath caught. His knees felt weak, and he reached for the nearest shelf to steady himself. "I have a daughter," he whispered. Rebecca looked at him then, her eyes full of guilt and sorrow. "Yes, and she doesn't know you exist." The heater clicked softly in the corner, a quiet reminder that life continued even in moments where everything seemed to stop. Daniel's mind raced with images of a child he had never met, of birthdays he had missed, of years that had passed without his knowledge. The weight of it pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. "Why now, Rebecca?" His voice broke. "Why tell me now?" She hugged the book to her chest like a shield. "Because running into you today, it made me realize I can't keep hiding forever. Emily deserves to know the truth. You deserve to know the truth. I just don't know how to fix it." For the first time in years, tears burned at the corners of Daniel's eyes. He blinked them back, his jaw tight. "Where is she?" Rebecca hesitated, then whispered, "She's here, in Portland, with me." The air between them thickened. Everything Daniel had lost, and everything he might still have, suddenly lay within reach, yet impossibly far away. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I need to see her," he said, his voice firm despite the storm of emotion inside him. Rebecca clutched the book tighter. "It's not that simple. She thinks my husband is her father." Daniel froze. His heart twisted painfully. "You're married?" Her lips trembled as she answered, "I was." "He passed away 2 years ago." Emily doesn't remember him much, but in her mind, he's still her father. "And if I bring you into her life now, I don't know how she'll understand it. I don't know how to explain." Daniel exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his wet hair. "You should have let me decide 12 years ago. Rebecca, you took that choice away from me." She bowed her head, tears dripping onto the cover of the book she held. "I know, and I'll regret it every day of my life." The sound of the bell at the front door rang again as another customer entered, shaking rain from their umbrella. The world outside continued to move, indifferent to the storm raging in the small bookstore. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't care how difficult it is. I want to see my daughter." Rebecca finally looked up, her eyes red but filled with a fragile kind of hope. "If you really mean that, then come tomorrow. Meet us here, at this cafe we usually go to in the mornings. I'll introduce you to her. But please, Daniel, don't rush it. Don't scare her. She doesn't know who you are." Daniel nodded slowly, his jaw tight with determination. "I'll be there." For the first time in 12 years, he felt as though he had found a piece of himself he hadn't even realized was missing. But the road ahead was uncertain, full of risks, and haunted by the choices of the past. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Portland in silver streams. Inside the bookstore, among the smell of paper and the whisper of pages being turned, a fragile agreement had been made. The next morning would change everything. For Daniel, for Rebecca, and for a girl named Emily who had no idea her life was about to shift forever. The night after their meeting in the bookstore was a restless one for Daniel. He lay awake in his small rented apartment on the east side of Portland, staring at the ceiling while the sound of rain drummed steadily against the windows. The city was quiet now, muffled by the downpour, but his mind was anything but still. Every thought led back to one thing: a daughter he had never known existed. He thought of Rebecca, too, of the way she had clutched that book against her chest, as if it could shield her from the weight of her confession. For years he had wondered why she left, replaying every memory, questioning what he might have done wrong. Now, he finally had his answer, and it was far heavier than anything he had ever imagined. By dawn, the rain had softened to a light drizzle. Portland was waking slowly, the sidewalks glistening from a night storm. Daniel rose early, unable to stay in bed any longer, and dressed carefully. He looked at himself in the mirror. Older now, the lines on his face deeper, his hair streaked with gray. Would Emily see him as a stranger? Would she recognize anything of herself in his face? He could not know. At 8:30, he left his apartment and took the tram toward the west side. The ride felt endless, the clatter of tracks and the occasional hiss of brakes marking each anxious second. His palms were damp, his heart unsteady. By the time he arrived at the cafe Rebecca had mentioned, it was nearly 9. The cafe was a small place tucked into a corner near a park, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. He stepped through the door, the scent of coffee and fresh pastries rushing to meet him. He scanned the room quickly, and there she was, Rebecca, sitting at a table near the window, her coat draped over the back of her chair. Across from her sat a young girl with long chestnut hair, her legs swinging slightly as she sipped from a mug of hot chocolate. Daniel froze. His chest tightened painfully, a strange mix of awe and grief washing over him. She looked so much like Rebecca had at that age. Yet there was something in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her chin, that was unmistakably his. Rebecca noticed him then. Their eyes met, and she gave the faintest nod, urging him forward. His legs felt unsteady as he walked toward them, each step heavier than the last. "Emily," Rebecca said gently as Daniel reached the table. "This is an old friend of mine. His name is Daniel." The girl looked up at him with curious brown eyes, her expression polite but guarded. "Hi," she said softly, her voice carrying the clear tone of a child who had been taught to be cautious around strangers. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Hi, Emily. It's nice to meet you." She nodded, then glanced at her mother, as if silently asking for reassurance. Rebecca offered her a smile, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. The moment was fragile, delicate as glass. Daniel pulled out the empty chair beside their table and sat down slowly. The warmth of the cafe contrasted sharply with the chill he still carried from outside, but it did little to ease the trembling in his hands. He kept them folded on the table, steadying himself with quiet breaths. For several minutes, the conversation was simple, almost mundane. Rebecca asked Emily about school, and the girl launched into a story about her art class, about the painting she was working on, a picture of a tree in autumn with leaves the color of fire. Daniel listened intently, nodding, smiling, though inside he felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, filled him with a sense of wonder and loss all at once. At one point, Emily turned to him directly. "Do you like to draw?" she asked, her head tilted slightly. Daniel's voice caught in his throat, but he managed a steady reply. "I used to when I was your age. Mostly little sketches. I wasn't very good, though." Emily grinned, the seriousness in her expression lifting for the first time. "That's okay. I can teach you." The words pierced his heart in a way he hadn't expected. He felt a warm spread through his chest, mingled with a grief so deep it nearly broke him. He wanted to tell her then and there who he was, what he had missed, but Rebecca's eyes met his across the table, steady and warning. "Not yet." The morning passed slowly, the small cafe alive with the sound of clinking cups, low conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter. Daniel found himself watching Emily constantly, memorizing her every expression, every movement. She was talkative when she felt safe, shy when uncertain, and endlessly curious. After they finished their drinks, Rebecca suggested a walk through the nearby park. The rain had eased into a fine mist, leaving the air damp but not unpleasant. Emily skipped ahead, her boots splashing lightly in puddles. while Rebecca and Daniel followed at a slower pace. They spoke quietly, careful not to be overheard. "You see her now," Rebecca said, her voice low. "Do you understand why I was afraid?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I understand the fear, but I don't understand keeping me away. She should have known me. She should have known the truth." Rebecca's eyes softened, though regret weighed heavily in them. "Maybe, but I can't change what's already been done. All I can do now is let you be here." Carefully, slowly. Daniel watched Emily run ahead, her laughter echoing faintly through the misty park. His heart ached at the sound, so pure and full of life. "I want to be part of her world, Rebecca. I don't care how complicated it is." Rebecca looked at him then, her expression a mixture of sorrow and relief. "If you mean that, you'll have to earn her trust. It won't happen overnight." He nodded firmly. "I'll wait as long as it takes." The three of them continued through the park, the city quiet around them, the trees dripping with leftover rain. To anyone passing by, they might look like a family out for a walk, a mother, a child, and a man quietly watching over them. But beneath that simple image was a tangle of history, of secrets revealed too late, of love and regret interwoven. As they reached the far end of the park, Emily ran back to them, slipping her small hand into her mother's. Then, after a moment of hesitation, she reached for Daniel's as well. The warmth of her hand had sent a surge of emotion through him so powerful he nearly stumbled. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but in that silent gesture, he felt the fragile beginning of something he thought he had lost forever. And yet, beneath the sweetness of the moment, the shadow of truth still lingered. Emily did not know who he truly was. That revelation, when it came, would change everything. The question was no longer whether Daniel wanted to be part of her life. The question was how long Rebecca could keep the truth hidden before it came crashing down, reshaping all their worlds once again. The mist clung to the trees, the city breathed around them, and the days stretched on, carrying with it the weight of what had been lost and the fragile hope of what might still be found. The days that followed were unlike anything Daniel had experienced in years. Each morning, he found himself waking earlier than usual, restless but with a sense of anticipation he could not shake. For so long his life had been steady, uneventful, marked by work and solitary evenings. Now, everything felt different. There was purpose in his steps again, and that purpose had a name, Emily. Rebecca had agreed to let him see them a few times a week, always in public places at first. Parks, cafes, even the small bookstore where their secret had first been spoken aloud. She was careful, cautious, and often reminded him not to rush, not to reveal too much too quickly. Daniel understood, but patience had never been harder. Each time Emily laughed, or looked up at her with her curious eyes, the urge to say, "I am your father," grew stronger. But he held his tongue, carrying the truth like a stone in his chest. On a Thursday afternoon, nearly a week after that first meeting, they gathered again at the same cafe by the park. The weather had cleared, the sun breaking through clouds that still carried the weight of autumn rain. Emily was busy coloring in a small notebook she carried everywhere, her brow furrowed in concentration. Daniel sat across from her, watching her little hand move the crayons across the page. "What are you drawing?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, a smile tugging at her lips. "A tree house. I want to build one someday. Do you know how to build things?" The question struck him with unexpected force. He thought back to his own childhood, to summers spent hammering old boards together in his grandfather's backyard. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I know a little. My grandfather taught me when I was your age." Her eyes lit up. "Then you can help me. Mama says I need someone who knows about wood and nails, because she doesn't." Daniel glanced at Rebecca, who was listening quietly, her expression unreadable. For a moment, He imagined a life where this had always been normal, where Emily had grown up knowing him, where building tree houses together would have been a natural part of her childhood. The thought filled him with both warmth and a deep, aching sorrow. "That sounds like a good plan," he said softly. Emily beamed and bent back over her drawing, humming quietly to herself. Later, as they walked the park, Rebecca fell back slightly, letting Emily run ahead toward the swings. Daniel slowed his steps until she was beside him. "You're good with her," Rebecca said quietly, her tone tinged with something he couldn't quite name. Daniel gave a faint smile. "She's easy to love." Rebecca's eyes softened, but she looked away quickly. "Don't get carried away, Daniel. She trusts easily, but trust can break just as easily if we're not careful." He nodded, though frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. He wanted to argue, to insist that Emily had a right to know, that hiding the truth would only hurt her in the end. But he kept his silence, knowing that pushing too hard might drive Rebecca away again. That night, back in his apartment, Daniel sat at his desk with a blank page before him. He tried to write down what he would one day say to Emily. How do you explain to a child that you've been absent not by choice, but by a decision made long ago without your knowledge? He started sentences and crossed them out again and again until the page was filled with nothing but scratches of ink. At last, he pushed the paper aside, burying his face in his hands. Meanwhile, Rebecca sat at her own home a few miles away, watching Emily sleep. The girl's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. Her lips parted slightly, her hair fanned across the pillow. Rebecca's heart ached with love, but also with fear. Daniel's presence was changing things. She could see how Emily looked at him, how quickly she had warmed to him. If the truth came out, would it destroy that trust? Would Emily feel betrayed? The following weekend, they met at the Saturday market in downtown Portland. The air was alive with the smell of roasted coffee, fresh bread, and flowers. Musicians played on corners, their songs weaving to the chatter of the crowd. Emily tugged Daniel from stall to stall, pointing out trinkets and tasting samples of fruit. Rebecca followed, watching them carefully. At one stall, Emily picked up a handmade bracelet and held out to Daniel. "This one's pretty. Don't you think so?" He nodded. "It is. Do you like it?" She smiled and slipped it onto her wrist. "It feels lucky. Maybe it can be my adventure bracelet." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, paying the vendor before Rebecca could protest. Emily's eyes sparkled with delight. "Thank you," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. The hug was brief, innocent, but it left Daniel shaken. He held on to the memory of it long after she let go. That evening, after dropping Emily at a friend's birthday party, Rebecca asked Daniel to walk with her along the river. The water reflected the city lights, shimmering in the cool night air. They walked in silence for a long time before she finally spoke. "She's growing attached to you," Rebecca said softly. Daniel kept his gaze on the river. "Isn't that what you were afraid of?" "That she wouldn't." Her jaw tightened. "I'm afraid because when she learns the truth, it won't just be about who you are. It will also be about what I've kept from her. She'll see me as a liar." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her. "Then let me take some of that burden. I'll be the one to explain. She deserves honesty, Rebecca. We can't keep pretending." Tears glistened in her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "Not yet. Please, just give me a little more time." Daniel wanted to argue, but the desperation in her voice silenced him. He nodded reluctantly, though his chest ached with the weight of waiting. Weeks passed, and their fragile arrangement continued. Daniel became a steady presence in Emily's world, someone who joined them for walks, who listened to her stories, who helped her with small projects. Each day his bond with her grew stronger, and each day the secret pressed heavier against all of them. One crisp November morning, Emily invited him to her school's art fair. Her paintings were pinned up on display, bright with color and imagination. She dragged him from one picture to the next, her face glowing with pride. Daniel praised each one, his voice warm and genuine. When they reached the final piece, a painting of a family standing beneath a tree, Daniel's breath caught. There were 3 figures, a mother, a daughter, and a tall man whose face was left blank. "Why didn't you paint his face?" he asked gently. Emily shrugged. "Because I don't know what he looks like. But Mama says he loved me." Rebecca froze behind them, her face pale. Daniel looked at her, his heart pounding, but she quickly turned away. That night, as he lay in bed, Daniel knew the time for silence was ending. The truth was already leaking into Emily's world, in questions she didn't yet know how to ask. He could not let another year pass in shadows. The rain returned, drumming against the city once more. In the quiet of his room, Daniel whispered a promise to himself. Soon, Emily would know. She had to. The days after the art exhibition unfolded with a strange rhythm for Daniel. On one side, he felt a quiet joy each time he spent moments with Emily. The little girl's laughter, her curious questions, and the way she smiled at the smallest things were like light in a life that had long been overshadowed by solitude. Yet, on the other side, the weight of an unspoken truth pressed heavily on him. Every small joy felt fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment once the truth finally came to light. Rebecca lived with the same conflict. She knew that the more Emily grew close to Daniel, the harder it would be to untangle the web of secrecy. She also knew she couldn't hide forever, yet fear kept her frozen. How would Emily react? Would her daughter feel betrayed, or worse, abandon the trust that had always tied them together? One gray afternoon in early December, Portland was soaked in a fine drizzle. The sidewalks gleamed wet, and cars left ripples on the puddles scattered along Hawthorne Boulevard. Rebecca had invited both Emily and Daniel to visit a small independent bookstore tucked in the corner of the street. Emily wandered eagerly into the children's section, while Rebecca leaned against a shelf filled with novels, and Daniel trailed behind them quietly, as though he had finally found comfort in the soft silence. Emily clutched a picture book in her small hands and turned toward her mother. "Mama, can I read this the night before bed?" Rebecca smiled. "Of course, darling, but you have to promise you won't stay up too late." Emily nodded quickly, then ran over to Daniel with the book pressed against her chest. "Look, it's about a bird who got lost but found its way home again. Like an adventure." Daniel's throat tightened. The child's innocent words struck him deeply. A bird lost and then finding its home. Wasn't that exactly what he was? A soul who had wandered for years and now stood just steps away from the home he didn't even know existed. That evening, after walking Emily home, Daniel lingered with Rebecca on the front porch. The dim porch light cast soft shadows across her face, revealing a mixture of weariness and worry. "She's becoming so attached to you," Rebecca whispered, almost as if afraid someone else might hear. "And I to her," Daniel replied gently. "But every time she talks about her father, every time she asks questions, I feel like my heart is breaking. She deserves to know. Rebecca, she has a right to know." Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling a long, trembling breath. "I know. I wanted to choose the right time. I can't bear to hurt her." "There will never be a perfect time," Daniel said softly. "The longer we wait, the harder it becomes." Rebecca looked away, staring into the drizzle that shimmered under the streetlight. "After Christmas," she finally said. "We'll tell her after Christmas. I promise." Daniel nodded, though unease still gnawed at him. The days leading up to Christmas carried both warmth and tension. Emily wrote a short wish list in her neat handwriting. She did not ask for expensive toys or things other children bragged about. Instead, Her list was filled with simple wishes: hot chocolate, a small doll, time with the people she loved. On Christmas Eve, Rebecca invited Daniel to join their dinner. The table was modest, adorned with candles, the smell of roasted turkey filling the small house. Emily sat between them, chattering happily about school and friends, occasionally laughing so hard her cheeks turned rosy. "I told my friend I have a new grown-up friend who always listens to me," Emily announced proudly, looking straight at Daniel. His heart melted, but Rebecca stiffened slightly. She knew what Emily was doing, unconsciously weaving Daniel into a place larger than she realized. After dinner, they moved into the living room. Snow had begun to fall gently outside the window, powdering the quiet street. Emily, fighting off sleepiness, curled up on the sofa with her picture book. Her small voice asked Daniel to read. He began softly, telling the story of the little bird that lost its way but eventually found home. Emily's eyes grew heavy, and as she drifted into sleep, her tiny hand clung to his, refusing to let go even in her dreams. Rebecca watched the scene with tears brimming in her eyes. The sight was too real, too powerful, to ignore. At that moment, she knew the waiting had to end. A few days after Christmas, she called Daniel. Her voice shook through the line. "Come tomorrow afternoon. I'm ready. We have to tell her." The following day was bitterly cold. Daniel arrived early, wrapped in a thick coat, his breath visible in the air. Rebecca opened the door with a tense face. Emily was in her room, busy drawing. They sat in the living room, silence heavy between them. The ticking clock was the only sound. Minutes later, Emily emerged, holding a sheet of paper colored with crayons. "Mama, look, I drew a big tree, and there's me and you, and..." She hesitated, then smiled. "My friend?" She pointed at the tall figure beside her own small figure. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. The drawing, though simple, carried something undeniable. Rebecca reached out for Emily's hand, her own trembling. "Sweetheart, there's something important Mama needs to tell you." Emily tilted her head, curious. "What is it, Mama?" Rebecca glanced at Daniel, silently urging him. His heart pounded as he knelt down to meet his daughter's eyes. "Emily," he began softly, his voice almost breaking, "the person in your drawing, the one you call your friend, I'm not just that. I'm part of your life in a much bigger way. I'm your father." The room fell silent. Emily blinked, her small face filled with confusion. Her gaze darted from Daniel to Rebecca and back again. "My father?" she whispered. Rebecca's voice cracked. "Yes, darling. I should have told you long ago. I was scared, and I thought keeping it quiet was protecting you. But it wasn't fair. Daniel is your father. He's always been out there, and now he wants to be here with you." Emily's lips trembled. She said nothing at first, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Daniel leaned closer, his own eyes wet. "I'm so sorry, Emily. Sorry I wasn't there for you when you were younger. I want you to know, from the first time I saw you, I only wanted to love you." But Emily's face twisted in confusion and hurt. She pulled back suddenly and bolted to her room, slamming the door shut behind her. Rebecca covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Daniel sat frozen, heart-shattering. He knew this was only the beginning. The hardest part was still ahead. That night stretched endlessly. Emily refused to come out of her room. Rebecca knocked softly, spoke gently, but her daughter's silence was the only answer. Daniel finally left, walking away from the house with heavy steps and an ache so deep he could barely breathe. The days that followed were filled with distance. Emily avoided Daniel, keeping herself occupied with books and drawings. Whenever he visited, she stayed quiet, offering only short replies or disappearing into her room. Rebecca felt crushed between guilt and fear. She had finally told the truth, but the wound it left was more painful than she imagined. She worried Emily might never forgive her. Yet Daniel refused to give up. He knew love could not bloom overnight, and trust once broken took time to mend. He promised himself he would not run again. No matter how long it took, he would remain steady and patient until Emily could see him for who he was. Winter slowly shifted. Snow began to melt, and rivers long frozen began to flow again. And with the turning of the season, somewhere deep inside Emily, a seed of acceptance began to stir, though she had yet to speak of it. Their story was far from finished. It was only the beginning of a long journey, through truth, through pain, and through the fragile, stubborn power of love that refused to let go. The weeks after the revelation moved like slow, heavy tides. Nothing was the same inside Rebecca's house. The air seemed thicker, conversations shorter, and silences more frequent. Emily, who once had been a lively, curious little girl, whenever Daniel was around, now carried a quiet tension whenever he stepped through the door. She spoke less, avoided his eyes, and often disappeared into her room at the first chance. Daniel felt the distance like a physical wound. He would sit at the dining table, his hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, watching the closed door of Emily's room as though sheer willpower could open it. Rebecca noticed his silent suffering, but she, too, struggled to bridge the growing gap. On a gray Saturday morning, Rebecca tried again. She stood by Emily's door, knocking gently. "Emily, darling, we're going out today. Just for a little while. Daniel is coming too." There was a pause, then the muffled sound of paper rustling. Emily was drawing again, her safe place. "Do I have to?" Rebecca's heart clenched. She opened the door carefully. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered around her. The drawing was a large tree again, though this time only two figures stood beneath it, a girl and a woman. No tall man beside them. "Sweetheart," Rebecca said softly, kneeling beside her, "I know you're upset, but he wants to try. He wants to be here for you." Emily kept coloring, her hand trembling slightly. "He wasn't here before. Why now?" Rebecca swallowed, unable to find the perfect answer. She only touched her daughter's hair, smoothing it gently. Sometimes adults make mistakes, big ones, but people can change. And sometimes they come back because love is stronger than fear. Emily didn't reply, but she didn't resist when Rebecca helped her put on her coat later. They went to Forest Park, where winter's chill still lingered. The trees stood bare, their branches etched against the pale sky. Daniel walked a few steps behind her first, giving space, watching Emily skip stones by a stream without looking at him. After a long silence, he crouched down nearby, picking up a flat stone. Without saying much, he tossed it across the water. It skipped 3 times before sinking. Emily glanced at him just for a second. Then she picked another stone and tried herself. It skipped only once. Her lips pressed into a thin line, somewhere between annoyance and curiosity. Daniel tried again. This time the stone skipped 5 times. He smiled faintly, not at his success, but because Emily's eyes had widened in challenge. She grabbed another stone and without a word, threw it. It skipped twice. The game continued for 10 minutes. No words exchanged, only the sound of stones hitting water and an unspoken rhythm forming between them. Rebecca watched from a distance, holding her breath. It was not reconciliation, but it was something. Later, when they sat on a fallen log to rest, Emily finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but clear. "Why weren't you there? When I was little." Daniel's chest tightened. He had imagined this question so many times, but facing it from her lips was different. "Because I made mistakes," he admitted. "I was afraid, and I ran away from things I should have faced." But if I could go back, Emily, I would choose differently. I would be there from the very beginning. Emily looked at the ground, dragging her shoe across the dirt. You can't change the past. No, Daniel agreed softly. But I can try to change now. If you let me. Emily didn't answer. She stood up and walked ahead on the path, her small figure framed by the tall trees. But she didn't run away, and she didn't ask him to leave. For Daniel, that was enough of the day. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their lives adjusted in slow increments. Daniel started visiting every Wednesday evening after work. At first, Emily stayed in her room, but over time, curiosity drew her out. She would peek through the hallway, listening as he spoke with Rebecca in the kitchen. One evening, when Rebecca was cooking, Emily tiptoed in. She sat at the counter with her homework spread out. Daniel noticed her from across the room. He didn't push, didn't overwhelm. Instead, he quietly asked, "Need any help?" Emily frowned at her math problems. "I don't get this part." Daniel pulled a chair closer. His voice was patient as he explained, his handwriting neat as he wrote examples. Emily leaned closer, biting her lip as she tried again. When she solved the problem correctly, a small smile slipped onto her face before she could hide it. Rebecca, stirring the pot on the stove, caught the moment and blinked back tears. Trust didn't bloom all at once. There were still nights when Emily locked herself away, still mornings when she avoided looking at him. But there were also new moments, small bridges being built, brick by brick. One Saturday, they visited Powell City of Books downtown. The vast maze of shelves overwhelmed Emily at first, but soon she darted into the children's section. She held up a book and asked Daniel, "Do you think I'd like this one?" He studied the cover, then crouched to her height. "It looks like it has adventure. Do you like adventure?" She shrugged, but her eyes glimmered with excitement. "Maybe." "Then let's find out together," he said. For the first time, Emily laughed at his words. It was brief, almost shy, but it was genuine. Rebecca saw it from across the aisle. Her heart lifted, but she also knew they still had a long journey ahead. Love was forming, yes, but acceptance was fragile. At home that night, Emily curled on the couch with her new book. She leaned against Rebecca, but when Daniel sat down on the other side, she didn't move away. Instead, she slid the book toward him, pointing at a line she wanted him to read aloud. His voice carried through the room, steady and gentle, and for the first time since the truth came out, the house fell whole. But healing is never a straight path. 2 weeks later, during a school project, Emily was asked to bring a photo of her family. When she returned home, she slammed her backpack on the floor, tears in her eyes. "They all have fathers," she cried. "They all had pictures. And I didn't. What am I supposed to show them?" Rebecca rushed to her, holding her close. Daniel stood frozen, guilt slicing through him. He wanted to reach out, but Emily's sobs filled the room with a wall he couldn't cross. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at an old photograph of himself, younger, reckless, the man who had once walked away. He realized that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to prove, through actions and time, that he was not going anywhere again. The next day, he arrived with a framed photograph. It wasn't perfect. It was taken only recently. With the three of them standing outside the bookstore, Emily caught mid-laugh. But it was real. He handed it to her quietly. "Maybe this isn't from the past," he said, "but it can be the beginning of what we build now." The rain had long stopped when the sun finally broke through the heavy clouds above Portland, casting a faint golden glow over the wet streets. The coffee shop, once wrapped in a rhythm of tapping rain, now carried the softer hum of ordinary life returning. Chairs scraped lightly against the wooden floor. The espresso machine hissed one last time before its barista started to clean it. and conversations thinned as people prepared to step back into their day. Emma and Daniel exchanged one final glance, the kind that carried more than words could hold. They both knew that morning had altered something in them, weaving an invisible thread between two strangers who just happened to share the same rainy shelter. For others, it might have been just a quiet morning in a Portland coffee shop, but for them, it was the beginning of a story still waiting to be written. And as they each walked out into the damp air, the city felt somehow gentler, as though it, too, had witnessed a small spark of connection form that rainy morning. That was what happened at the coffee shop in Portland. Not an ending, but the start of something neither of them would forget.